The red and blue lights washed over the lottery shop's facade as I stepped inside, the stench of disinfectant mixed with stale sweat clinging to my throat. 3 hostages knelt with their hands on their heads, the floor littered with shards of glass and streaks of blood trailing like rails right up to my boots. He was behind the counter, simple mask, steady pistol, gaze that never wavered. Slowly, "Mellow 3-5 Alpha," he said, as if he were reading my training file. My radio crackled on my shoulder, but his voice cut sharper. "Take 1 step closer, and the woman in the yellow dress passes out for good." I froze. No one there should have known the name they called me in the barracks. No one outside my unit. "Remember the yard at 5 in the morning? The weight of the rifle? The taste of iron in your mouth? Remember me, Mellow?" The woman sobbed. The night guard panted, and I realized the barrel of his gun wasn't aimed at the register. It was aimed at the boy clutching a crumpled lottery slip. "Last chance," he whispered. "Drop your weapon or I'll say the name you buried years ago." And then he spoke a name that existed only in my darkest memory, and pulled the trigger. I was born and raised on the outskirts of São Paulo, in a neighborhood where every street corner carried a silent warning that life could change in a second. My mother was a nurse, spending sleepless nights at the hospital, and my father, when he wasn't fixing cars in the garage, was fighting to keep his head above water after losing his job at the steel plant. I grew up watching them both battle against a world that always seemed determined to swallow us whole. And maybe that's why I chose the uniform. Not for glory, but because I wanted to be the wall between chaos and those who didn't have the strength to defend themselves. From the very first day at the barracks, I carried the weight of rigid discipline and a loyalty many couldn't understand. On the training field, every run with the rifle, every sleepless night, every push-up in the rain shaped not only my body but also the conviction that I could never falter, ever. I had no right to fail, and yet I did. Years ago, an operation left me with a scar no uniform can cover. I lost a colleague who trusted me, someone who called me brother in arms. The sound of the gunfire from that night still echoes in my head, and since then, every time I walk into a dangerous situation, I feel like I owe an invisible debt. At the precinct, some see me as too relentless, others as cold. But the truth is, I've only learned to hide the storm behind an expression that betrays nothing. Outside the job, solitude is almost a rule. Relationships that never survived endless shifts. Childhood friends who drifted away, family visits made in a hurry, always carrying the silence of someone who doesn't know how to explain the choices he's made. My values are clear, but my peace is always clouded. I believe in justice, but I know it doesn't always come in black and white. I believe in protecting, but I've had to shoot to kill. I believe in truth, but I carry secrets that can't be spoken. When that criminal called me by the name that only echoed inside the barracks, it wasn't just a threat. It was a direct strike at the man I became. Because if he knew that name, then he knew the part of me I fought to bury. The part that carries mistakes, memories of faces I'll never see again, and pacts I thought were long gone. My uniform may cover my body, but it doesn't shield my soul from the ghosts that return to haunt me. And suddenly, standing before those hostages, I wasn't just the cop on the scene anymore. I was once again recruit Mellow 3-5 Alpha, and someone on the other side of that gun seemed to know exactly how to rip that wound wide open. It was a stifling Friday afternoon. The kind of heat that makes the vest stick to your skin and your patience evaporate faster than sweat. I was in the patrol car, parked in front of a corner, bakery, mentally reviewing a shift that felt too quiet to be real. The radio had been silent for nearly half an hour when suddenly it burst to life with the dispatcher's sharp voice, cutting like a blade. "Attention! All available units! Robbery in progress. Possible hostage situation at a lottery shop on Avenida Sapopemba. Preliminary reports indicate armed individuals, number unknown. Immediate containment requested." My heart jolted in my chest. Hostages. That word never comes alone. It always, drags with it the weight of lives hanging on seconds, on split-second decisions. I hit the siren and accelerated, slicing through narrow streets as the whale forced cars apart like waves splitting before a hull. As I drove, the radio kept spitting out fragmented updates. One witness swore there were 2 masked men. Another insisted it was only one, but said he was yelling non-stop, threatening to shoot anyone who moved. The picture forming in my head was broken, but my instincts already knew this wouldn't be simple. When I turned onto the avenue, chaos had already spilled over. People were running in every direction, some in shock, others live streaming someone else's terror as if it were entertainment. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with smoke from a car that had skidded onto the sidewalk. I pulled up just a few meters from the lottery shop, and the street looked like a war zone frozen in place. Civilians pressed against a hastily set perimeter, officers trying to keep order, and the glass facade of the store reflecting the flashing police lights over and over. Inside, it was eerily still. No movement, just the faint echo of silence, like everyone inside was holding their breath. I grabbed the radio, took a steadying breath, and announced my arrival. Alpha 35 on site, awaiting orders. The reply came fast. Alpha 35, hold position. Armed suspect confirmed. Hostage situation ongoing. Negotiation attempted, but suspect refuses to speak with command. He demands one person only. You. My blood ran cold. For a split second, I thought I'd misheard, but the dispatcher repeated. The assailant is asking to speak exclusively with Officer Mello 35 Alpha. The weight of that call hit me like a punch. This wasn't chance. This wasn't luck. Someone inside knew who I was. Knew things no outsider should know. Suddenly, the incident stopped being just another mission. It became personal, almost intimate, as if the walls of that lottery shop had turned into a courtroom where my past would be dragged into the light. The tension thickened by the second. Hostages kneeling, a gun pointed, the desperate eyes of the crowd outside. My grip on the rifle was steady, but inside my chest, my heart hammered like a war drum. I knew then there was no turning back. This wasn't just another call over the radio. This was the beginning of a reckoning I never thought I'd have to face. And before I even stepped through the lottery shop's door, I understood. The line between officer and man was about to shatter in ways I couldn't control. The street seemed frozen in time as I stepped out of the patrol car. The heavy heat of the afternoon was now cut by the red and blue strobes flashing against the avenue's walls, turning gray facades into the backdrop of a surreal nightmare. The crowd's noise was a chaotic chorus, families desperate to know if their loved ones were inside, bystanders filming live, neighbors cursing yet another outbreak of violence in the neighborhood. The air smelled of sweat, exhaust fumes, and something sharper, the metallic scent of fear. Each step brought me closer to the shattered glass door of the lottery shop, and with it, the sense that I wasn't just entering a crime scene. I was crossing an invisible threshold into something far deeper, something pulling me straight back into memories I had sworn were buried. From outside, I could barely make out anything, just shadows shifting under the flickering fluorescent lights. A woman in a yellow dress trembled so hard she looked like she might collapse. The security guard sat frozen, arms raised, eyes wide as if trying to predict the gunman's next move. Then came the sharp, metallic thud of a pistol striking the counter, and I knew instantly, this man wasn't there just to rob. He had a purpose, and that purpose was me. Command tried to hold me back. Mello, maintain distance. Wait for the negotiator. But the radio crackled again, carrying that grave, steady, all too familiar voice. I said I'll only talk to Mello 35 Alpha. If he doesn't come in, someone dies. The silence that followed was crushing, as though even the engines of the squad cars had stopped to listen. I looked around, teammates with fingers on triggers, ready to fire at the slightest signal, officers barking orders to keep control, civilians praying in whispers behind the barricades, and in the middle of it all, the certainty that I had no choice but to cross that threshold. My hands were steady, but inside, unease gnawed at me. The lottery shop's facade was just broken glass and a crooked sign swinging in the breeze, but to me it looked like the entrance to a tribunal of the past. Every shard of glass catching the flashing lights seemed to whisper that this wasn't just another mission. It was a summons, tailor-made for me. Hearing my old barracks call sign echo over the radio was like a knife cutting through time. It hurled me back to training yards at dawn, the stench of gun oil, the exhaustion of endless drills, superiors barking that number as if it were my only name. I froze at the doorway. Inside, dead silence, broken only by a muffled sob. My breath fogged the visor of my vest, blinding me for seconds that stretched into hours. To everyone outside, I was the hero stepping into danger. But I knew that once I crossed that doorway, I might not be confronting just an armed criminal. I might be facing the ghost of my own past. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't arriving at the scene that unsettled me. It was recognizing what waited inside. As the crowd shouted, the radio buzzed with orders, and time seemed suspended, a single thought struck me like lightning. Maybe the true hostage in that lottery shop was me. I crossed the doorway of the lottery shop, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes behind me. It was like stepping through a portal, leaving behind the deafening sirens and plunging into a suffocating silence, broken only by the restrained sobs of the hostages. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust from shattered glass and the cold sweat of fear that clung to the walls. I took 2 slow steps, rifle pointed down, when his voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Slowly, Mellow 3-5 Alpha. In here, I give the orders." The way he used that name wasn't a detail. It was a calculated strike. He wanted everyone to know he knew me, and he succeeded. The hostages turned their eyes toward me, as if expecting I already held the answers to this nightmare. His position was tactical. Behind the counter, half-covered, pistol pressed firmly to the head of a boy clutching a crumpled lottery slip. The child barely breathed, eyes fixed on the floor, paralyzed by terror. One wrong word, one twitch, and it would all end in blood. I steadied my breathing, adjusted my stance, and raised my voice, trying to sound firmer than I felt. "Calm down. You called me, and I'm here. We'll do this your way, but no one gets hurt." He laughed, short, sharp, filled with contempt. "Your way? You still don't get it, Mello. Or did you forget what we used to do before the sun came up?" Each word tore open wounds I had fought to bury. To my colleagues outside, he was just a criminal in crisis. To me, he was someone who carried pieces of my past I had never shared. Tension crackled through the air. The woman in the yellow dress collapsed to her knees, sobbing. The guard muttered something like a prayer. The gunman barely moved, but his finger on the trigger twitched, as if one more heartbeat would set it off. I edged a step closer, cautious, deliberate. He snapped immediately, lifting the pistol toward me, eyes burning like embers. "Not one more step. You want to play the hero, but I know the fraud you are." The hostages panicked. One screamed, another tried to crawl across the floor. The atmosphere was seconds from spiraling into chaos. My training roared in my head. "Stay calm. Control the scene. Don't let panic win." I raised my hands, rifle still secure but showing I wasn't about to shoot. "Look at me. I'm here. Forget them. Forget everyone else. Talk to me." He laughed again, louder this time, almost unhinged. "That's exactly what I want, Mello. Just you and me. The rest, they're disposable pieces." To prove his point, he pressed the barrel harder against the boy's temple. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt like it could slice skin. Sweat trickled down my back. The realization hit me like a blow. The situation had reached its breaking point. Every second stretched between life and death. The radio hissed in my ear with orders to hold, to wait, strategies being drafted outside. But none of that mattered. Inside, it was just him, me, and the countdown of a lit fuse. The action had escalated to its peak. One wrong move, and this place would turn into a massacre. And still, deep down, I knew I had no choice. Face to face with this armed ghost, my fate would be decided right there, in the fragile balance, between his rage and my resolve. The next moment felt like time itself had lost its urgency. Every breath echoed inside my helmet. Every heartbeat pounded so loud it seemed to fill the room. I scanned everything. the sweat rolling down the boy's forehead as the gun pressed into his temple, the woman in the yellow dress biting her lips until they bled, the security guard frozen stiff in the corner. But it was in the gunman's eyes that I saw something that stopped me cold. It wasn't the wild rage of a desperate thief. It was a look I had seen before, long ago on the training grounds, when two recruits pushed their bodies beyond the breaking point, under the punishing dawn. And then, slowly, almost theatrically, he pulled off his mask. The cloth fell to the floor, revealing a face my memory fought to deny. But denial was useless. The hard jawline, the weathered features, the thin scar above his left eyebrow, it all dragged me back through the years. He wasn't a stranger. He was Rocha, the E. Same Rocha who had run endless drills beside me, who shared cold rations in the dead of night, who once grabbed me by the vest when I was about to collapse from exhaustion. My body froze. The rifle was steady in my hands, but my muscles felt like lead. My voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. "Rocha?" He smirked, a crooked smile twisted with resentment. "So you do remember." The hostages' cries faded to background noise. The whole world narrowed to that face from my past. The last time I saw him, he was being escorted out of the barracks, disgraced, accused of insubordination and ties to schemes that tarnished the uniform. I didn't defend him. I didn't speak up. I just watched in silence as they dragged him away. And now, years later, he stood in front of me with a gun in his hand and vengeance in his eyes. "You became the battalion's golden boy, didn't you?" he spat. "You climbed the ladder, earned respect, play the hero for the cameras. And me? You know what happened to me. You know what my life turned into after you all turned your backs." His words were knives, carving into wounds I thought had healed. Memories of cold hallways, hushed conversations, superiors whispering judgments without ever explaining. Suddenly all of it came roaring back. He yanked the boy closer, pressing the pistol harder against his head. "I didn't come here for money, Mello. I can steal that anywhere. I came here for you, to show you that you can't bury the past without paying the price." So, revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't a robbery. It never was. This was retribution. I wasn't staring at just a criminal. I was facing a man who once wore the same uniform I did, a man who knew every command, every code, every corner of my life as a cop, and now he was wielding all of it against me. The discovery tore me open. Rocha was my enemy, yes, but he was also a distorted mirror of what I could have become. A fallen brother in arms, turning innocent hostages into pawns for his vengeance. And the question clawed at me with brutal force. How do you negotiate with a man who doesn't want money, escape, or power, but only to make you feel the same pain that's been devouring him since the day he was cast out? And in that frozen moment, as our shared memories clashed harder than the weapons in our hands, I understood. The real danger wasn't the gun aimed at an innocent child's head. It was the past I had tried to bury, now staring me in the eyes, demanding a debt I wasn't sure I could ever pay. At that moment, standing face to face with Rocha, I felt the full weight of the uniform crash down on my shoulders. The radio hissed in my ear with clipped commands: hold position, buy time, wait for reinforcements. But none of it mattered. I wasn't facing an ordinary criminal, not a robbery I could resolve with tactics and protocol. I was facing a fragment of my own past, a ghost in uniform that I had helped bury in silence. And the worst part? He knew it. My hands stayed firm on the rifle, but inside, I was trembling. Every word Rocha spat peeled away layers of armor I had built over the years. He spoke of the barracks like reciting a broken oath, recalled the dawn drills as though they were blood pacts I betrayed when I didn't defend him. And deep down, I knew he was right. I had watched him fall. I had seen him dragged out, humiliated, stripped of his future. I had been there, and I had said nothing. That silence burned like acid now. Could I have done something? Could my testimony have changed his fate? How many times had I asked myself, alone, if my cowardice back then had been the true crime? Rocha was living proof of my failure, an omission that had haunted me ever since. The battle inside me was unbearable. On one side, The officer drilled to neutralize threats, save hostages, follow procedure without hesitation. On the other, the man who remembered late nights in the yard, shared rations, the loyalty of someone who once pulled me up when I was ready to fall. I was trained to pull the trigger, but how do you aim at someone who once walked the same path? How do you shoot at the reflection of what you might have become if your life had gone differently? My mind split in two. One voice screamed that hesitation would cost innocent lives. The other whispered that killing Rocha would mean killing the last thread of a brotherhood forged in sweat and silence. The woman in yellow sobbed. The boy whimpered under the gun, and yet my heart couldn't decide if the man in front of me was an enemy or a lost brother. Then came the darkest fear, recognizing myself in him, because deep down, I knew I wasn't as far from that abyss as I wanted to believe. How many times had I thought of giving it all up, of letting resentment corrode me, of walking away from a system that chooses who to protect and who to discard? Rocha had been consumed by that bitterness. I had clung to silence and discipline, but staring into his eyes, I realized the line between us was thinner than I ever dared admit. The radio barked again, demanding a status report. I didn't answer. How could I explain to command that the man holding a gun to an innocent's head wasn't just a criminal, but a chapter of my own history? That this wasn't simply a hostage negotiation. It was a negotiation with myself, with my guilt, with my fear of being just as fragile as he was. And that's when the truth hit me. My greatest enemy wasn't Rocha. It was me. The version of me that stayed silent when he needed me. The cowardice that I buried under medals and routines. And now, with lives hanging in the balance, I had to choose whether to repeat that same mistake or finally face the past head-on, even if it cost me my blood, my career, or my soul. The moment I decided to act didn't come as a sudden spark of courage. It was the buildup of sleepless nights, of every time I'd let the truth die in silence. I could feel time dripping away inside that lottery shop. Each second, a coin slipping out of reach. Rocha clung to that boy like he was the last bargaining chip left in the world. And for a heartbeat, I almost gave in to the urge to end it with one clean, lethal shot. But then I saw the child's trembling, the way the woman in the yellow dress stared at me with eyes begging for a miracle, and I knew that pulling the trigger would only stack tragedy on top of tragedy. So I took a breath, lowered the rifle slightly to a neutral position, and held my voice steady. "Rocha," I said, not like an officer confronting a suspect, but like a man calling another by the name he once carried with respect. "We don't have to spill blood today." His lips curled into a bitter laugh, but his finger didn't pull. Every word I spoke felt like a blade slicing through his rage, trying to reach the wound festering underneath. My decision, in that instant, was to risk everything on a conversation instead of a bullet. I radioed in quickly, instructing the tactical units to hold their positions. No forced entry. I could have given the order to breach, to overwhelm him with firepower, but procedures don't account for when the man holding the gun is a brother the system abandoned. I chose to gamble on words, on guilt, on the fragile thread of memory. I edged closer, slow, measured. I spoke of things no one else in that building could know. The drills at 5 in the morning, the burden he carried, the humiliations that piled up until they broke him. I wasn't just talking to him. I was confessing to myself. "I should have spoken for you that day," I admitted, the words tasting like steel in my mouth. His eyes flickered, and for a second, the gun wavered. That was when I pushed further. I pulled at the bond we once shared. Sweat-soaked camaraderie, bad jokes whispered during endless drills, the small gestures of loyalty forged in uniform. I told him the silence that day had haunted me, that it was a mistake I carried every time I looked in the mirror. I didn't offer, absolution. I didn't promise freedom. I offered him a chance, surrender, a fair hearing, the possibility to speak truths no one ever let him say. Then I did something more dangerous. I asked him to let the boy go, slowly, carefully. I promised I would stand between him and everyone else. Step by step, I shifted so I was closer to the hostages than he was, showing I was willing to take whatever came next. The boy stumbled free, sobbing, and I knew then that my choice had done more than buy time. It had opened a crack of humanity in a man buried under anger. The decision wasn't heroic. It was raw, filled with fear. I knew the fallout would come, investigations, reprimands, maybe worse. But in that moment, I chose to face the wound instead of hiding behind protocol. I chose the shame of admitting my failure over the false comfort of silencing it with a bullet. As Rocha stared at me, caught between rage and disbelief, I realized that whatever the outcome, the hardest part was already done. I had faced the man I used to be, and for once, I hadn't stayed silent. The silence that followed after the boy stumbled free was like a sudden blow. Not relief, but reality, crashing in all at once. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then the chaos erupted. Voices crackling over radios, clipped commands from command staff, the metallic snap of handcuffs separating the before from the after. Outside, the crowd burst into a strange mix of applause and confusion. Some people cried, others shouted, Few vomited out their relief. Inside, the hostages clung to each other as if to make sure they were still alive. But for me, everything moved in slow motion. Every step of the tactical team, every movement of the medics, filtered through a haze of guilt and gratitude that had nowhere to settle. Rocha kept his hands up, his expression a mask the years hadn't fully hardened. He looked at me like a man seeking approval and finding only echoes. Outside, I heard the operation chief barking. Instructions, hold him, no one rushes in, and felt two colleagues moving in, careful, weapons lowered, eyes flicking between professionalism and disbelief. Within minutes, that felt like hours. Handcuffs clicked shut, procedures were called out for the record, and the hostages were guided to waiting ambulances for shock and injury checks. The boy cupped his face in his hands, trembling. The woman in yellow was wrapped in a blanket, whispering, "Thank you," over and over like a prayer meant to stitch the moment back together. The radio filled with requests for updates, reports, the arrival of investigators. The commander approached me with eyes full of mixed relief and reproach. He needed me to stick to procedure because the machine must keep running, because above the city's wounds there are always rules to enforce. I explained briefly, without dressing it up in heroics, who Rocha was, the confession I made, the choice to negotiate. I could see in his face the austere understanding of someone who knows the code, and also the shadow of disapproval from someone who expects unwavering firmness. Immediate consequences came swift and unyielding. Internal affairs was already on its way, as the forensics team sealed off the scene. Evidence was photographed, bagged, tagged. News crews swarmed outside, spitting out half-truths and headlines before the first report was even filed. Gunman demands specific officer in hostage standoff. I caught a glimpse of it on a phone screen while slumped in the back of a squad car, forehead resting against rain-fogged glass. Inside me, the consequences were harsher. The knot of guilt tightened, now laced with fear of the fallout. I knew my decision. Speaking, exposing myself, risking a personal negotiation, would be dissected frame by frame. Some colleagues would call me reckless, superiors would question the breach of protocol, and maybe an inquiry would threaten everything I'd built. Yet there were also looks I hadn't expected. Quiet. Respect from those who understood bravery doesn't always fit the manual. Some of the hostages, tears streaking their faces, touched my arm and said my name with trembling gratitude. In that small human touch, I felt a kind of confirmation. No matter what the investigation brought, I had spared lives. Rocha was led out under heavy guard, still shouting half-coherent phrases. Names from the barracks, grievances spat like confessions, vows of revenge. Watching him go, I felt as if not only he, but a piece of my past was being escorted away, no longer hidden. And in the heat of that aftermath, I caught a glimpse of what lay ahead. Reports, interviews, possible charges, an internal affairs case. But the only consequence I couldn't measure was internal. How I would look at myself in the mirror of the uniform after admitting that omission had shaped me as much as discipline. As we cleared the scene, the lottery shop remained marked not just by broken glass, but by stories that would now have to be spoken aloud. My hands still trembled, but I understood something. The next hours would bring scrutiny, yet also a strange cleansing. For the first time, I had dragged the past into the light, and though the immediate consequences were uncertain, they showed me one thing clearly. The truth, even painful, never leaves anything quite the same. The hostages were already evacuated, Rosha was in handcuffs, and the scene was winding down when I asked for a few minutes alone with him inside the transport van. The commander frowned, but allowed it. Maybe because he saw in my eyes something that couldn't be explained in reports or protocols. I stepped inside and sat across from him, the cold metal barrier between us doing nothing to ease the weight of the moment. He was drenched in sweat, breathing hard, but his eyes still burned with the same fire that had ignited everything. "You should hate me," he said, spitting the words like venom. "Instead, you sit there looking like some priest, ready to absolve sins. What, do you pity me now?" I stared at the empty space between us before answering. "It's not pity. It's a debt, and I can't run from it anymore." Rosha barked a bitter laugh, the sound bouncing against the van's steel walls. "A debt? You never understood. I was thrown out like garbage while you stood by. I screamed mellow. I needed someone, and you just stayed silent." The words cut deeper than any knife. My throat tightened. Finally, I said the truth I had buried. "For years, you're right. I stayed quiet. I failed you, and that silence has been eating me alive ever since. I don't know if it changes anything, but I'm sorry." He blinked, taken off guard as if those words were the last thing he expected to hear. The silence between us stretched into an abyss. Behind the bars, his eyes shifted, not just rage anymore, but pain. A flicker of the camaraderie we once had. "Sorry doesn't erase the years I spent becoming an animal," he muttered, voice cracking. "No," I said, "but maybe it's the first time someone admits you didn't fall alone. Maybe it's the start of you speaking instead of just screaming. You don't have to fight this war by yourself." The air grew unbearably heavy. Rosha pressed his forehead against the steel grate, eyes shut tight, and whispered a sentence that will haunt me forever. "You were supposed to be my brother to the end. Maybe now, maybe it's already too late." And in that fragile moment, I realized something had shifted. The gun, the rage, the violent spectacle, those were only his shields. Beneath them was a broken man, and for the first time in years, he had heard truth from the one who abandoned him. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a turning point. Two ghosts in uniform finally looking each other in the eye and saying what silence and time had never allowed. When I stepped out of that van, my legs felt like stone, but I knew that conversation had cracked something open. Rosha might never. Heal might carry his darkness to the grave. But for me, it was the moment I understood that the uniform doesn't absolve us of human responsibility. And sometimes the hardest bullet to swallow doesn't come from a gun, but from the words we choke back out of fear. When dawn broke over the city and the suffocating heat of the previous day gave way to a cold wind sweeping through nearly empty streets, I was already back at the precinct. The echo of sirens still rang in my ears, but it was the silence in my own chest that unsettled me most. I sat on a bench in the locker room, vest still clinging to my body, staring at the fractured mirror on the wall. For the first time in years, I didn't see the disciplined officer, the man trained to follow orders and never falter. I saw the young recruit who once stood frozen as injustice devoured a fellow soldier, and I realized that, in a way, I had never left him behind. The conversation with Rocha had ripped open a wound I'd been hiding, beneath layers of work, reports, operations, and the mask of a man who doesn't feel. But the truth was, I did feel, and deeply. Guilt, fear, cowardice, and an emptiness no medal or promotion could ever fill. Hearing him say I should have been his brother to the end made me understand that the uniform, heavy as it is, doesn't excuse our humanity. I wasn't there only to follow orders. I was there to carry the weight of the bonds we forged. and that was the weight I failed to honor. Still, when I finally spoke the words I had never dared, when I admitted my silence had betrayed him, some of that crushing burden lifted, not because the debt was paid, it never would be, but because I finally acknowledged out loud that I was wrong. That admission changed me more than any successful operation ever could. I learned that courage isn't just charging into gunfire or storming a room full of hostages. Courage is also admitting failure, asking forgiveness, and facing the truths we bury. That night, I realized I couldn't change what Rocha had become, but I could change what I would be moving forward. The transformation began right there, in front of that cracked mirror. No longer the cold officer who hides his ghosts, but the man who decided never again to keep silent. I needed to rescue the truth, no matter how painful, and it had to begin with me speaking up, breaking the cycle of silence that had dragged Rocha and so many others into the abyss. I also reflected on what the uniform really means. I had always seen it as a shield, a wall against chaos. But that night I understood it can also be a prison, when it forces us to hide who we are and what we feel. The uniform can't be an excuse for cowardice, nor a reason to look away from injustice. I promised myself I would never again let another brother fall without raising my voice. I swore that just as I risked my life on the streets, I would risk my reputation, if necessary, to stop the machine from grinding someone into dust. The transformation didn't stay hidden inside. In the following days, when giving my statement and facing questions about every decision I made, I noticed my answers carried a different weight. No longer automatic, no longer mechanical. They came with conviction, with honesty. It was as if that night had torn away a blindfold I didn't know I was wearing. I wasn't just an executor of orders anymore. I was a man determined to carry the truth, even when it burns. And that was the greatest revelation. Sometimes the enemy we fight isn't holding a gun. It's hiding inside us. I had spent years chasing criminals, but I had never confronted my own omission until Rocha forced me to. And now, scarred but changed, I know I'll never be the same again, because surviving a case doesn't just mean coming out alive. It means being able to face yourself the next morning. And on that cold dawn, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might finally be saving myself. The conclusion of that incident didn't come with the sharp crack of gunfire or the triumphant cheers of a team returning victorious to the precinct. It came in silence, in the slow shuffle of exhausted steps, in the metallic snap of handcuffs being locked inside the transport van, in the hollow eyes of the hostages still trying to grasp how they had survived something that could so easily have ended in blood. Outside, the street was already emptying. The crowd dissolved into murmurs. A few reporters lingered, fishing for sound bites, but everyone else wanted to forget what they had just witnessed. I stood for a long moment in front of the shattered lottery shop. The glass on the ground reflected the flashing lights like open wounds, and a streak of dried blood on a pillar was proof of how close death had come. The forensics team moved methodically, photographing every detail, tagging evidence, picking up bullet casings that thankfully had never been fired. The radio now carried no urgency, only flat voices, filing technical reports, marking the operation as concluded. In the official records, it would be summarized as robbery with hostages neutralized, no fatalities. A clean report, tidy enough to fit into a few pages, but I knew that what had happened in there could never be reduced to statistics. Success or failure wasn't measured only in lives saved. It lived in the weight each of us would carry afterward. The hostages were formally released after being examined by medics. The boy, the one who had felt the barrel pressed against his temple, clung to his mother, who cried uncontrollably as she pulled him into her arms. The woman in the yellow dress was sent to the hospital for observation, her body trembling, her eyes still fixed on the moment she nearly collapsed. The security guard, an older man with years of fatigue etched into his face, simply embraced me tightly, wordless. Sometimes silence speaks louder than thanks. Rocha, meanwhile, was taken away under heavy escort. His face, was no longer the same as when he had shouted my name at the start. It carried both defeat and resignation, but also something else, a strange flicker, as if he had achieved what he wanted after all, to force me to face the past I had buried. As I watched him step into the van, I felt that it wasn't just him being taken away. A piece of my own history was being driven off too, no longer hidden. The commander pulled me aside, away from cameras and microphones. His voice was sharp, without embellishment. You broke protocol. There will be questions, but you saved every hostage. The city will call it a success. Internal affairs may not. I nodded silently. I already knew, but for the first time, I didn't care about the bureaucracy that would follow. Because the real conclusion wasn't in paperwork. It was in the fact that, in the middle of chaos, I had chosen a path that wasn't the easiest or the most expected. Back in the patrol car, exhaustion finally hit me like a wave. My body ached, my mind throbbed, but there was a strange peace in knowing no one had died. The operation was technically over, but inside me, something new had begun. I was no longer the same officer who had arrived on that street hours earlier. I carried with me the certainty that the greatest danger isn't always the weapon aimed at us, but the silence we allow to fester inside. The case was closed with reports, evidence collected, hostages safe, and a suspect in custody. But for me, it ended the moment. I realized I could no longer be the man who stays quiet. From then on, every mission, every operation, every confrontation would also be a way of honoring the silent promise I had made to Rocha and to myself. Never again let omission be as lethal as a bullet. The sun was rising when I finally left the precinct. The city was waking up, pretending nothing had happened the night before, as if the blood that nearly stained the floor of that lottery shop had evaporated along with the night dew. For most, it would be just another headline swallowed by the endless cycle of news. But for me, that incident had carved an invisible scar, one that wouldn't fade, a mark that reminded me of who we really are when the masks fall away. I walked down streets, still damp from the night's rain, watching bakery owners lift shutters, buses filling with workers, children heading to school with backpacks bigger than their bodies. Life carried on as if nothing had changed. But inside me, normalcy had been stripped away. I was no longer just the cop who had entered a hostage situation and left with everyone alive. I was the man who faced the reflection of his own silence, who spoke with the ghost of his youth, who realized, brutally, that the line between hero and villain is thinner than we want to admit. The lesson I carried wasn't about negotiation tactics or emergency protocols. It was about humanity. I learned that the uniform protects the body, but it doesn't shield the soul. That no wall of discipline can hold back the rot of silence, fear, and cowardice. That day taught me courage isn't only rushing into danger, it's also admitting failure, asking for forgiveness, and carrying the weight of our mistakes. I thought about Rocha, chained, being taken to face the consequences of his crimes. To many, he was just another number in the system, another criminal. But I had seen the man behind the handcuffs, broken by his choices, yes, but also by abandonment. And that forced me to accept that evil doesn't always grow alone. Sometimes it's cultivated by omissions, by silence, by collective cowardice. I don't excuse what he did, but I understand the abyss that swallowed him. And that understanding, painful as it is also a kind of justice. That morning, I made a decision. I would no longer be just the officer who obeys. I would be the man who speaks, who exposes, who faces not only criminals, but also the failures within our own system. Because if we don't have the courage to confront our flaws, we are doomed to repeat them. And I could not bear to watch another brother fall while I stood in silence. The final lesson, the one I now share with you, is simple and brutal. We all have a Rocha in our lives. A ghost from choices we made, a memory of when we kept quiet, a debt we don't know if we can ever repay. Running from those ghosts only makes them stronger. Facing them, no matter the pain, is the only way to keep them from coming back armed against us. As the sunlight caught the rear-view mirror of the patrol car, I understood that survival isn't just making it out alive. It's being able to look in the mirror the next day and not turn away. I survived that standoff, but more importantly, I survived myself. And if you've stayed with me through this story, I leave you with an invitation. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me which part struck you most. Because in the end, these stories aren't just about police and criminals. They're about humanity, choices, and the weight of silence we either carry or finally let go.